The Russians have decided to launch an offensive into the Kharkiv Oblast. There have been reports of them capturing some small villages, some small settlements across the border. Nothing is 100% confirmed yet, because right now, this is the dynamic. It's like, here's a report of something being captured, but then there's no pictures, and then there's no video. And all the video we're getting is stuff like this. Stuff like very far from the battle. You know, you're in the Kharkiv countryside, you can look out and you see smoke, but nothing from there. Or all the pictures that I have seen have been like, here's a body here, here's a body there. Nothing that's geolocatable that can prove the movement of the Russian army. And of the only videos that are like that, it's just like Russian tanks blowing up. So right now, we don't have any solid geolocatable proof about Russian army advancements. So take all of this with a gigantic grain of salt. We can look at the deep state map to look at the areas that people are saying that the Russian army advanced, and the Russian army is trying to advance, so don't be too surprised if they have. But all this area right here, you see this gray area, this is all contested about what they could have captured by now. So we have locations, oh, one second, let me switch this to English. You can see there's a few villages here that people are talking about, maybe they're capturing. But the big thing, or at least the thing that's creating the most reaction from the local administration, is the advances up here, because not only is there the possibility of the Russians capturing these villages over here, which is what the reports are saying, but that they're shelling and glide bombing this small city down here, Vovchansk. I'm really bad at pronouncing it. All the Ukrainians can cringe and throw tomatoes at me if they want. That's getting hit with glide bombs, getting hit with artillery, which has caused the local authorities to call for an evacuation from the city, from the settlement, and start to engage in evacuations. Now, why someone would stay in a city, in a village this close to the Russian border, considering there's war? Well, it might be because they grew up there the whole life and they feel very connected to the city. It could be because they believe by being in the Kharkiv Oblast, they're continuing to support the Kharkiv economy, they're continuing to support Ukraine, and that is one way of resisting. It could be that they're just straight stubborn. It could be any number of reasons. But people are starting to evacuate now. The order has been given and evacuations are underway. These offensives are not only being done with personnel, but they're being done with armor as well. So this is not just like a small raiding party here, a small raiding party there, but it seems to be a semi-determined effort by the Russians to capture villages, to capture territory, and to probe into this area. Now, the Financial Times and others are reporting on this, and the giant angle I'm seeing right now from not only the Financial Times, but a few outlets, but not being covered universally, even though I think it should be covered like this universally, is this last part of this. Let me read this, and it's the last part. Russian forces have launched an armored attack on Ukraine's northern Kharkiv region as Moscow seeks to take advantage of its superior weaponry and manpower before the arrival of U.S. military aid. And so this is being framed within the discussion of American military aid being delayed for 6, 7, 8 months upon basically entirely partisan domestic political politics. There was not a vote on it, even though when it did pass, Ukraine aid had 73% support. It has overwhelming support with the majority of the American population. It has overwhelming support in the House, overwhelming support in the Senate. And the legislation that was eventually passed was not really tremendously or really all that different at all from the legislation that was proposed 6 months ago, outside of the fact that there was a lot of Republican infighting in between those two dates. The date that that bill was introduced 6, 7, 8, 9 months ago, and when it was introduced again by Mike Johnson with a few alterations, including turning the financial aid into a loan at Trump's request in order to try to gather a little bit more support for it. Did it get the holdouts to not come against him, to not vote against it? Of course not. Marjorie Taylor Greene still voted against it, and Marjorie Taylor Greene still pursued a recall vote for the House Speaker. They failed. They failed, showing that there's maybe a good reason to believe that they could have done it 6 months earlier, but Ukraine aid was delayed. And I think for a lot of people, they treated this issue as if it was just like, oh, I don't know, like it's just some infrastructure reform here, some infrastructure reform there. And I'm not saying that infrastructure reform isn't important. If you take too long on infrastructure investments, bridges can collapse, potholes can fill, people, train lines can derail. You can have real deaths from that. But when we're talking about an advancing army, when there's a real time constraint on your aid, on your support, sitting on your hands for 6 months is strategically absolutely Neanderthal brained. It is knuckle dragging behavior. There was 6-month period where we could have sent support. We could have sent more cluster M115 munitions. We could have, 155 millimeter shells, which we have in storage. We could have sent more Patriot air defense. We could have sent more supplies. Now, some of it isn't produced, but we could have started the process of producing. We could have started the process of investing into military infrastructure to produce these weapons. We could have sent what we did have, like we just did with the ATACMS about a month ago. Hell, we could have sent those ATACMS before the Zaporizhia counteroffensive, so they could have disabled the helicopters, but that shoulda, coulda, woulda. Point is, as the Ukrainians were facing starker and starker ammunition shortages, and they were warning of these ammunition shortages month before the ammunition shortages happened. Then the ammunition shortages happened, and then they warned of them, and then the ammunition shortages got worse, and then they warned of them again. None of this created an impetus to act, and so we waited. We waited until, under my estimation, now this is me reading how Mike Johnson came forward and talked about it, it seems that Mike Johnson was terrified by an intelligence report into finally supporting Ukraine aid. Now, I warned for a bit that my big fear wasn't necessarily even no aid gets sent, which was of course a fear, but my fear was that due to the partisan political shifting and using Ukraine in the largest war in Europe as a partisan wedge issue in order to edge your political opponents, by doing that, you had delayed aid for so long that by the time you would be scared into action by an intelligence report showing the possibility of a breakthrough, it might already be too late. Maybe not already too late to necessarily win the war or come back or try to regain that land later, but too late to win certain battles, too late to hold back the Russian army, too late to stop any breakthroughs, too late to keep the casualties lower, too late to make the Russians pay more for land advancement or land captures, like, for example, the Battle of Avdiivka, or as we're seeing right now, the Battle of Chasiv Yar, which we're seeing Chasiv Yar get destroyed block by block, building by building. And I'm going to be releasing a documentary of some of the time I've spent in Chasiv Yar in about a month, maybe a month and a half. I don't know by the time that I release that documentary if we're even going to still have Chasiv Yar under Ukrainian control, because the situation has gotten so bad. And Chasiv Yar is an important barrier between other major cities in the Donetsk region, some of the largest cities still left unoccupied in the Donetsk region, like Konstantinivka, Seversk, Kramatorsk. It's a major location. And the outcome of this battle could be different. It's impossible to know for sure, but it could be different if we had signed this bill 6 months ago and the aid arrived 3 months ago. And so the Russians, talking about attacking Chasiv Yar, would have to be like, oh, we're going to have to deal with these cluster bomb munitions. Oh, we're going to have to deal with all these unitary 155 millimeter shells that are going to be hitting us. Oh, we're going to have to deal with these ATACMS, like hitting our, not only a troop training, but also any offensive force that's gathering far behind the line. Oh, we're going to have to worry about this. We're going to have to worry about these, the mortar shells, because they just got a new shipment of mortars. Oh, we're going to have to, but no. What I'm hearing is that we're going to get the first Czech initiative. This was the initiative where the Czechs gathered a ton of artillery shells off the open market, off the weapons market, came to Europe, came to NATO, came to Ukraine's allies and said, let's buy them. These buyers want to be discreet, but you give the money, we'll get the shells. The first of those shipments should be arriving next month in June. But that means for the rest of this month, May, the Russians are going to be likely, and many analysts, including me, I wouldn't call myself an analyst, I don't know what you're going to call me, have been warning of, is that the Russians are going to push, and they're going to push, and they're going to push in this period before the shells arrive in droves. Because once the Czech shells arrive, and then the American shells arrive, and all these supplies arrive, then it's going to be much harder for the Russians to push forward, because they're going to have to push forward with a much smaller shell disparity. And the shells that are arriving from the West, well, it's harder to tell about the Czech initiative, but definitely the United States, are not going to be of a piss poor quality. They're going to be of a good quality. Definitely if they're going to 155 millimeter artillery systems. And so this is time that has been lost that cannot be regained. And all we can do is try to move forward. But the reason I'm hitting on this so much right now is because this is going to have a real impact on how this Kharkiv offensive goes. This had a real impact on how the battle in Avdiivka went, just like the Ukrainian and American officials said. And it's going to have it's already having an impact on how the Battle of Chasiv Yar is going. And for the future, we cannot let these types of national security issues just get caught up in partisan political divides and then start treating the clowns in Congress who are up there yelling about how the Ukrainians, and this is a real thing Marjorie Taylor Greene complained about on state TV, are sacrificing babies and eating them and selling their organs in order to raise money for the war effort. Or, oh, you know, we care so much about the Hungarian community and their language speaking rights, we can't send aid because Marjorie Taylor Greene has a passion about Transcarpathia. She never said the word Transcarpathia until some Russian staffer somewhere told one of her staffers who told her to say the word Transcarpathia. No way in hell. But having this delay it because of how small the Republican House majority was and how much outsized leverage they had over a new inexperienced House Speaker and Mike Johnson. I mean, there's a lot of Ukrainians here who legitimately believe that those politicians have blood on their hands, and it's very hard for me to argue with them. Point is, the Russians are trying to move and take advantage of our inaction, of our sitting on our hands for months as the war continued to develop, which is not only going to have an impact on this war, but is also going to have an impact on the confidence other allies have in the United States around the world. Anyway, the Russians are pushing in this area. We're getting reports of losses on the Russian side, of armored vehicles getting destroyed by drone attacks. There was some chatter that the Ukrainians might have known this was coming in advance and pre-positioned troops. There's also been updates about them repositioning reserves into the area in order to counter. All I know for sure is that right now, the battles in these areas are fierce. Any village getting captured for sure has not been 100% confirmed. All that's been confirmed is that the fighting right now is very fierce and that the Ukrainians are trying to evacuate this city here, and they're trying to evacuate other civilians from the surrounding villages, which is going to be important as the Russians continue to push in this area. Why are the Russians doing this? That's the first question. And the second question is going to be, what do I expect the success to be? So first, why are the Russians doing this? Well, I guess there's a few ways you can look at this. The first way you could look at this is in relation to the recent Ukrainian raids over the border. The Ukrainians have done a lot of raids into the border, or you could say a lot of Ukrainian-backed Russian forces, like the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Free Russian Legion, all these other people. They have done raids over the border into the Belgorod region, over into other regions. And so maybe this is an effort, and you can see it's concentrated in the Belgorod region. Maybe this is an effort to create a buffer zone so that the Ukrainians are not able to raid into the Belgorod region, make Putin look weak, make their border control look weak, and undermine Russia's control of its own territory. So it could be an attempt to create that type of military buffer zone. That would be a costly operation to maintain the buffer zone. But if you're faced with the question of permanent Russian troop deployments in this area to stop cross-border raids, or creating a buffer zone and then continuing with operations elsewhere, I mean, it's not impossible to see them coming to that conclusion. But either way, if they create that buffer zone is also going to have to be staffed by Russian soldiers in order to hold it, so they don't have another Kharkiv counteroffensive. Because you see all this green territory here? All of this was taken back by Ukraine in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. And so I don't think they want to face that humiliation again, because not only did they lose all of this territory that they captured, they also lost a lot of equipment and a lot of soldiers, both to prison and to death. So it might be the creation of a buffer zone. It could also be that they want to pull Ukrainian troops away from other battles. The Russians right now are pushing really hard in a ton of areas. They're trying to capitalize on the breakthrough that they had here during a troop rotation between the 47th Mechanized and the 115th. And I've heard a lot of rumors about the 115th, but from what I've heard, it's not a question of cowardice. It's a question of the 115th. When they came to the position after a mistimed troop rotation, the Russians had already had the positions they were supposed to be rotated into, and then they were not given mechanized or artillery support to take those positions. That's the story I'm hearing down the grapevine from the people into 115th. I've heard a lot of people call the 115th cowards. I have no evidence that it was done to cowardice. I've also heard other reports that chemical weapons usage in this area could have also contributed to the breakthrough, but it's hard to say. The breakthrough was the line around the line here. They broke through to capture this village, and now they're capturing some of the surrounding villages. The Ukrainians, though, are making them take a lot of losses, a lot of casualties in order to take this territory. But if they have to move more soldiers when the Russians are already gaining some land here, not only could that take pressure off the advancing Russian troops, maybe helping them advance more, but it could also mean that they take less casualties. And so for anywhere where the Russians are facing trouble, like, for example, they're trying to take Chasiv Yar, what would help them take Chasiv Yar? If there were less Ukrainian soldiers defending Chasiv Yar and more Ukrainian soldiers diverted to fight in the Kharkiv Oblast. So it could be creating a buffer. It could be trying to divert Ukrainian troops. It could also be that they want to create pressure to take back this territory so they can create pressure on the Donetsk region. The Ukrainians recapturing Izium and Lyman and all of these areas, Kupiansk, was really bad for the Russian plan of taking the Donetsk region. And part of the reason why the Russians had to do frontal assaults on cities like Bakhmut, just go again and again and again, taking insanely high casualties, the level of casualties that no Western military would accept for the small amount of land that's being captured. A lot of the reason they had to do that is because they could no longer just depend upon encircling the region, which if they had Izium and then they had Lyman, they could try to encircle Slovansk. Maybe they could try to encircle Kramatorsk. Maybe they could try to push down and eventually encircle Konstantinivka, which I've spent a lot of time in Konstantinivka. I like Konstantinivka. The people there are nice. But if they want to encircle any of these locations and not have to take it through frontal assault, which is going to come with insanely high casualties, well, that's a problem if they've been pushed back. So it might be that this is the start of an attempt to take back all the territory that they lost from the Kharkiv counteroffensive so they can put more pressure on the Donetsk region, because if there's any military objective that has been unchanged from the start of the war, is that the Russians want to take all of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Another possibility, and we're engaging in a lot of speculation here, and I want to say that openly, that this is speculation. I don't have knowledge of Russian military command. I know what I've been told by Ukrainian soldiers, and that's why I can say what I said about the 115th. I know what I've been told by other journalists. I know what I've been told by people who are in the know, but I'm not in the know when it comes to the Russian armed forces. So right now, this is speculation, and I want it to be known that this is speculation, and this is what I am trying to conclude as of right now. So don't take this like, oh, this is all of this is true, or all of this is gospel. This is speculation. It could also be that the Russians want to take Kharkiv. If you look at where they're attacking, it's quite close to the city of Kharkiv. Not only were the Ukrainians prioritize defending it, because there's a lot of civilians there. Friend of the show, Anastasia lives there. A lot of other people live there, and they want to protect those civilians. They want to protect that city. But the Russians have been claiming on both state media, amongst many of its politicians, that Kharkiv is a Russian-speaking city. And back in 2014, they did try to create the Kharkiv People's Republic. It failed, and those people trying to do that were beaten up and they were pushed out. But at the start of the war, the Russians tried to walk straight into Kharkiv, and they were thrown out. And so I am not convinced that the Russians have completely given up on the idea of taking Kharkiv as a Russian-speaking city, because it does largely speak Russian. They do have a lot of claims on Kharkiv, both in Russian state media and in the political apparatus of Russia. And, I mean, if Putin believes what he believes about Ukraine only being able to exist as an extension of Russia, and how he wants to quote unquote liberate the Russian-speaking people, even though in most instances it's liberating them from their lives, then that would include capturing Kharkiv. And the Russians have never given up, officially or publicly or rhetorically, the idea that they should own and possess Kharkiv. And so if they want, it could, if Putin wants to, I don't see how anybody could stop him from saying, let's try to put more pressure on Kharkiv, in the process set us up for future operations to take it. Of course, this is speculation. We don't know this for sure. It could be any of these things. If you were to ask me which of these scenarios I think is the most likely, I think the buffer zone is likely. I think the attempt to put more pressure on Donetsk is possible, and I think that the Kharkiv operation might be is also like semi-likely, but likely in the idea that this is something they one day want, but not that this is the start of an operation to take Kharkiv. Again, this is all speculation. So, as for how I think the Russians will perform, the Ukrainians have sent up defensives in the Kharkiv region under the assumption that the Russians are going to attack this area again. I have not seen those defenses. I've seen defenses all across the region in Donetsk, because that's where I'm doing most of my work, but I have not been in the Kharkiv region for a while, and all of my attempts to do reporting in the Kharkiv region near the front line outside of, I did some reporting on like Balaklia, but it was like demining reporting and stuff like that. I have not been in places like Kupiansk to see the defenses, so I cannot tell you what those defenses are like. What I can tell you is that I know that they've invested in the defenses there, and that the Ukrainians are going to try to rely on those defenses. So I cannot tell you how the Russians are going to perform, but as of right now, there has been no evidence of a big breakthrough. So if I remember at the start of the battle for Avdiivka, the Russians tried to do a big breakthrough on the sides, so like a big pincer maneuver to surround the city, and it failed. And it failed not only a little bit, it failed spectacularly. There was a moment where they had some advancements, but they went to push back, and then they kept pushing, and they just lost more and more and more and more and more. And so as of right now, I'm not saying that it looks like those level of losses or anything like that, but if there was an attempt to break through the line, as of right now, we have not heard any word that there has been a successful breakthrough of the line, that Ukrainian positions were strained due to manpower shortages or munition shortages to such a point that they cannot defend the Kharkiv region, and that they've put all their resources into the Donetsk region. So if anybody was of the assumption that, oh, the Ukrainians are on the brink, say like a Douglas McGregor or a Scott Ritter, I'm sorry to say that as of right now, the Kharkiv counteroffensive is not proving that. Now, that's not a lot of detail for how I think the Russians will perform, but that's also because this operation is less than 24 hours old, and we know less than the bare minimum of what would be necessary to make an accurate prediction, well, at least a well-informed, semi-accurate prediction. You don't know if it's an accurate prediction until after the fact, but I think that we don't have enough information to make any strong predictions. So this is the layout of this offensive. This is what we know as of right now. I'm sure we're going to get more information in the days to come. I'm sorry I don't have that information now for the people who are going to be watching this YouTube video or the segment after the fact as more information has come out. But as of right now, the Russians have launched a new offensive into the Kharkiv region. If there was an attempt at a breakthrough, it certainly hasn't succeeded as of yet. We don't have any confirmation on the capturing of villages, but there is disputed control of these areas, and the Ukrainian government is evacuating cities close to the front, like here, where civilians are present and could be put at risk due to the bombardment as the Russians unleash glide bomb bombardments on the Kharkiv Oblast. And this is all while the city of Kharkiv itself has been bombarded near non-stop, with recent weeks showing air raid sirens on for 11 to 12 hours a day in the city of Kharkiv. And a lot of my friends there are constantly just having to spend night after night in their corridor in case their building collapses on top of them due to Russian bombardment of the city and civilians getting killed in strikes on civilian infrastructure as of late. I hope everybody in the city stays safe, and we will keep a close eye on the developments as the Russians launch a new offensive. Is this the big offensive we've been waiting for? We'll have to wait and see to find out.